So my guest, who's been kind enough to be on our show several times, is Dr. John Moore. He's professor of microbiology and immunology at Weill Cornell Medicine. He's best known for his research on HIV and AIDS. He received his BA, MA, Master of Philosophy, and PhD degrees from Cambridge University. And he joined Weill Cornell in 2000. He directs several NIH and other sponsored grants. And Dr. Moore was one of 270 physicians, scientists, and healthcare workers who signed an open letter to Spotify calling on Spotify to implement a better misinformation policy. So, Dr. Moore, thanks for joining us. And I always say you don't have a crystal ball, but what is happening with COVID right now? Because cases are on the increase. Actually, I can read I did print out the numbers, but they're increase everywhere. But sorry. As of Thursday at 8 in the morning, the unofficial U.S. COVID toll was 83,698 cases and 1.004 deaths. So it's an increase of 218,146 in cases and 913 in just one day. So, and New York City is in high alert. There are many countries that the CDC says you shouldn't go to, like practically every country. So what is happening? And now I believe the BA1 variant is the one that's predominant in the United States. So if you give us just an overview of what is happening and what's going to happen in the next few months, if you can.
Well, we're still in the Omicron stage of the pandemic, which started in approximately December of this year and caused a huge surge in December and January and February that everyone surely remembers. That peak has since declined, went down as low as 30,000 recorded infections a day from a peak of around 750,000. So it went down a lot in March and into April, but it's now gone back up, and the nationwide recorded infection number is close to about 80,000 a day. But of course, that's a huge underestimate because the onset of widespread rapid test use at home means that a lot of people don't follow through on a positive test and report it to CDC or the local New York area or their local area health authorities. So a lot of people are testing positive and they're invisible to the recording systems. So the net effect is there's a lot of virus still circulating. In the Omicron lineage, which started off with BA1 and then became mostly replaced by a slight variant of that called BA2. And there are a couple of others on the prowl at the moment that will probably take over from BA2 because, as we've seen over and over again, it's always the most transmissible variant that grows to dominate in the end. Death rates at the moment are around 300 to 350 a day, which, you know, it's a lot less than the peak of a couple of thousand a day, but still translates to an average rate of 100,000 or so a year. So that's a lot of people still dying of COVID. Most of them are unvaccinated. That's not changed for a long time. Vaccine immunity has been waning for two reasons. Firstly, the time since most people had their last dose, whether it be the second, third, or in some cases fourth, we know that infection blocking immunity wanes over time. We've known that for a long time now. And the Omicron variants are substantially resistant to the neutralizing antibodies that the vaccines induce. So the time taken for antibody immunity to fall off the useful scale is much quicker. So many more people lack the protection against mild infections. And I emphasize mild infections because what we're talking about here in vaccinated people is a large number of relatively mild infections of the, I've tested positive at home, I'm going to not feel great for a few days, I'll be back at work in a week or so. What we're not seeing is a large increase in deaths among vaccinated people, because the overall constellation of immunity that is conferred by the vaccines is holding up very well, whether you've had 2 doses, 3 doses, or 4 doses. And that means that vaccinated people are generally not being seen in the hospitals and are not being ending up in the ICU and the morgue. That's not an absolute, but still the vaccines are giving approximately 10-fold protection against death. So your chance of dying from COVID is reduced by around 10-fold at the moment if you're vaccinated. Your protection against infection may only be a factor of 2. So that's, a not insignificant drop in protection against infection. But still, unless you're got pre-existing conditions and have responded poorly to the vaccine and are in high-risk groups, the vaccines are still keeping you out of the hospital and the ICU and the grave, which is the most important aspect of it. So that's where we are at present. What will happen in the future? We're all in the same dilemma of not having crystal balls. We've never been able to accurately predict the future. But we've seen every year of the pandemic, this is now the 3rd year, the previous 2 years, we've seen summer surges, particularly in the south, when, although you think that, if it's a flu model, which it isn't really, a respiratory virus may not spread as well in hot weather. What happens in hot weather is that people understandably go indoors into air-conditioned bars and restaurants and other venues. And when they cluster together inside in an air-conditioned venue, that actually increases transmission rates. And there's starting to be signs in some of the vaccine data of what's called behavioral disinhibition. That it's a sort of technical term, but this is how it works. That people who think they're vaccine protected against mild infections increase their risk, they change their behavior to behave more riskily. And because the vaccines are not protecting as well against mild infections, that the net effect is actually an increase in the infection rate by the behavioral change. So you think you're protected against infection, but you're less protected than you actually are. And the behavioral changes then kick in and you're more likely to be infected. But again, not at the level where you have to go to hospital. So we're starting to see signs of that in some elements of the CDC data, because everybody wants the pandemic to be over, and therefore people are trying to live their lives in a pre-pandemic mode, but it's still risky if you are concerned about getting mild infections. So, that's again where we are. Next month, the FDA is going to hold a advisory panel meeting with its independent experts to discuss how vaccine strategy might evolve for later this year, for the fall. When and for whom are additional boosters justified? Is it appropriate to change the composition of the standard vaccine to reflect an Omicron sequence? And we can talk about that a bit. And if so, when? Because if you change the composition, you do have to make a large amount of new vaccine, which will take multiple months. So if a decision is taken in June, it's with the idea of rolling out the changed vaccine in, November approximately, which would be before the Thanksgiving and then Christmas and New Year travel seasons that in the past 2 years have seen major surges. I mean, the highest infection rates nationally we've seen have come in early January of 2021 and 2022, because that reflects the lag time after the triple travel of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year, which, involves a lot of people mingling in areas where they're likely to transmit virus. So the idea will be to see what vaccination recommendations are required or appropriate to take it to get prepared, optimally prepared for that travel-inspired a surge of infections this winter. So we'll be interesting to see how that discussion goes. Of course, people who have refused to be vaccinated will hardly likely to change their mind and suddenly decide that they've been waiting all along for an Omicron vaccine. That's if your objection to vaccination is because it's because of the politics and the disinformation. Changing vaccine composition isn't going to make a world of difference. And studies that have been released a couple of weeks ago show that their best estimate now is that about 320,000 of the Americans who've died in the pandemic, just over 1 million total, 320,000 of them died after refusing to take the vaccines that they had available and were entitled to. And some of them were due to vaccine hesitancy, but many of them were killed by disinformation. They believed the lies that is spread on social media and right-wing media and refused to be vaccinated, and that's cost 320,000 lives, and that number is only going to increase. So what might happen? Do we need an Omicron vaccine, and how well will it work? Well, there's an important data set that we're all waiting for, that we originally told Moderna would release the results, and I think Pfizer as well, in around the end of March, beginning of April, of a clinical trial. And that's not happened for whatever reason. So we don't have the data. And the experiment was to compare a booster based on the Omicron vaccine, the original BA1. It was directly compared with a booster in the other half of the study group with the standard vaccine, obviously both mRNAs. So would the Omicron vaccine booster perform better than a standard vaccine booster? So we don't know the answer, but we do know preliminary monkey studies that were done in this experimental format with both an Omicron booster, and there's experiments done with a Delta booster last year, and a Beta booster were all done. And they all showed that when you use these changed composition vaccines as boosters, there's really not much difference in performance compared to giving at the same time, giving instead rather, the standard vaccine booster. And that reflects immunology. What the booster does is reawakening the original vaccine response that you had to the original vaccine, which has actually improved over time. I mean, the vaccine response matures over time. In the 6 months after your second dose, the vaccine response does improve. That's called affinity maturation. But once it's improved over that 6-month period, the two different boosters, at least in the animals, had a similar effect on reawakening those B cells and triggering a new wave of antibody production. They weren't identical, but the difference was pretty subtle, and it wasn't like a gangbusters Omicron is better. So we'll wait and see what the human data is. So the argument goes both ways on this. If it's not much better, why would you go to the expense and hassle of changing vaccine composition and rolling out a new vaccine strain? If it is a bit better, the Omicron response is a bit better, how much does it matter? What's the definition of bit? How big an increase or how great a superiority would it be to justify rolling out the new vaccine? And that's going to be down to the advisors. I mean, maybe in humans, the Omicron vaccine boost will be so much better that it's an obvious decision. But we'll see. And that's one of the reasons why you accumulate the data and then you review it by independent experts and they come up with a recommendation. My feeling is that unless the Omicron booster is worse, I think FDA and the administration will go with an Omicron booster, really irrespective of how much it's justified. I think there's a lot of perception in this that the public will feel that an Omicron vaccine is going to be better, and maybe you just give the public what they want. If it's no worse, then there's no harm, and it might sort of just boost public confidence and say we're giving you a new and better vaccine, even if it's not that much better. For people who have never been vaccinated or never been infected, and there aren't that many around now, but there's still, still some. If they got an Omicron vaccine as their first vaccine experience, I'm not sure how well that's going to do. Again, there are some animal studies that indicate that may not be great as a vaccine in the standalone context. And the antibody response that's induced by the Omicron vaccine will not deal very well with the previous variants, the Delta, the Alpha, if they ever reemerge, which is by no means certain. So, the science gets increasingly complex on all of this, and it's good that we have a lot of experience now of what to look for, and we have well-qualified independent advisors, and external advisors will all weigh in, and hopefully the FDA will make the wisest decision. The other wild card is that because Congress is doing its usual thing of dicking around and not doing its job and spending the time arguing politics with each other, there is not yet an appropriation of funds that would buy a new tranche of vaccines for use in the fall. We would literally run out of money, and also for free COVID tests and drugs like Pavloxid that some people are finding valuable. So, there's a genuine funding shortage here, and Congress is dicking around because that's what Congress does. The one other bit of vaccine news that you will see is that in the first week in January, about 2 weeks' time, 10 days' time, the Novavax vaccine is being reviewed in the FDA advisory meeting for its EUA application, and it's pretty likely that it will be approved. Again, there would have to be money to buy it, which I don't know what the financial arrangements there are, but that would be useful as a booster vaccine for people who have elected to veer away from mRNAs because they've had a couple of rough responses. I mean, the third dose uptake in America is only about half of what it should be, maybe less than that. So a lot of people who offered the first booster dose didn't take it, which is a mistake because that's an important dose. And at least some of them, probably many of them, did it because they were put off by the sore arm, and I've got a hangover type of feeling, the headaches, the mild, inconvenient local responses. But some people decide that's too much for them. Novavax is milder on the arm and the headache level, according to clinical trial data. So it could be useful for that population of people who fear the sore arms. And it should be good as a booster based on studies that have been done in a couple of countries. And it would be a good vaccine as a first vaccine for people. And there are people who genuinely can't take mRNA vaccines because they've got a PEG allergy. It's pretty rare, but PEG is a component, and we had examples of allergies. So Novavax could be an additional useful weapon in the vaccine fight, and that should be approved in the next month, I'd hope. And that's about it. That's my kind of overview of where we are.
Okay. So Novavax in the United States? Approved?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the Novavax trial was finished in the early part of 2021, but it's taken them a long time to solve production problems. It's all about the production. It's not about the efficacy or the safety. And in the end, an Indian company solved problems that other sites were not able to solve. And the vaccine that would be used in America, if Novavax is approved, is actually going to be made in India. And that's actually a first for the FDA. The FDA was never yet approved a foreign manufactured vaccine in this context, but has signaled that it is satisfied with the quality of what's being made in India.
Yeah, so I, want to make, an observation or two, just based on, people talking to me, the people writing Twitter or whatever. But, first of all, I mean, less and less people are wearing masks. I was on the subway yesterday, and there was a mandate. And I would say 3/4 of people aren't bothering, and so there's come to be an acceptance. I mean, even my the doctor said to me, well, everyone's just going to get it. So, and then there's also the antivirals that people think, well, if I do get it, at least I can get the antivirals. So there seems to be like a more of acceptance and a little bit less fear because of that. But I think it's a big mistake that people aren't wearing masks. I mean, I felt better when I went to theater where they checked the vaccine status. They still ask a mask. That's it.
Yeah. Well, that's this behavioral disinhibition factor I talked about, that people think that they're not at risk, so they increase the riskiness of their behavior. Yeah, I wear a mask on the subway. I'm in New York City. Right throughout the pandemic, the population who never wore masks were always the cops. I mean, I thought that was outrageous. Even at the height of the pandemic, they refused to wear masks because they're cops and they can do that kind of shit. But I was really found that terribly bad message to the public. But yeah, you're right. There is less mask wearing on the subway. In shops, I find people generally are wearing masks. It's still
less than, well, it used to be universal. Now it's not as many people.
It's not as
But I was in the state of Florida, and no one wears a mask.
Well, Florida, that's been the case throughout Florida is, the kind of place that should just sink into the Atlantic Ocean and we could all be cheering if we get rid of it, like Texas. But yeah, I mean, Florida is full of crazy people, and they've never taken the pandemic seriously.
Is the ability to get antivirals, is that also something that's disinhibiting people a little bit?
I'm not sure. They're not that widely available, Pavloxid. It's still just, the government doesn't have a large supply of it because it's increasing over time. You have to get a diagnosis. You have to get a prescription. You have to get the drug. And it only works if you take it in about the first 7 days. After that, it's basically useless. So you can't sit around for several days at home and go, oh, better go out and get a prescription. By that time, it's too late. So it's most useful for people who are most at risk of anything bad happening to them, as a serious COVID. So it's not that widely used, but it is available if you know how to get it and use the system. There's also this strange phenomenon increasingly being seen whereby after you take Pavloxid and then you stop taking it and then you test positive again. So the virus resurges after you finish taking Pavloxid, then you suddenly start, not particularly sick again, but you start failing tests and can't go back to work if you play by the rules as people should. And one of the downsides of taking an antiviral very early on is it reduces the amount of virus that the immune system can respond to. And sometimes you reduce it so far that you don't develop a good immune response. And then the virus is still around at low levels, and then you stop the drug and it just comes back, and then it will trigger again the immune response. So that's another complexity that's been seen. But anyone who's in a high-risk group and knows it should, know how to get a prescription for Pavloxid and take it if they, truly feel, or their physician feels they would benefit from it. But for a healthy 30-year-old, vaccinated, healthy 30-year-old, I don't think you should be taking antivirals. I don't think you need to take antivirals, put it like that.
Okay, so if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and I'll get to them. So the other question is I had about is it was very difficult to get tests, home tests for a while. Now every time I pass my some person's office, I say, they're just out there giving out tests to everybody. Is this a good idea that people should be home testing?
Well, it was wise to get them when they were first distributed free. I certainly have done that. My wife and I went to friends for dinner, last Saturday, and one of the guests is immunocompromised, and quite reasonably, our hosts asked, would we each take an antigen test on the day of the dinner party, which we did and tested negative. And that, I think, was an appropriate thing to do because one of the guests could have had a problem. And there's a new wave of, I think, 8 tests being distributed. There's a mobile testing vans on the street. So that's, easy, quite expensive actually, but you can get them on insurance. They can get reimbursements on insurance, I think, mostly. So yeah, if you feel the need for a test, they're readily accessible, and in some circumstances they may be particularly important. I think it's another one of those situations where you use common sense.
Well,
But
Walgreens told me I can get 4 tests a month free.
I don't know what there was. I had an email from somebody who said that you can order 8 tests, or maybe it was 8 tests per couple, maybe it was 4 each.
It's 4 boxes with 8 tests.
Yeah, there's 4 boxes with 8 tests. Well, we ordered them. I mean, we got 1 left out of the first 4 that we got free. And I just had to buy 1 today for use. I'm going abroad, and then I've got to take a test under video monitored conditions to be able to get back into America, which is, not like we don't have plenty of virus here. They're scared about me importing it on the plane with them. But, so it's a bit of a palaver, but you have to buy a test and then do it via video from your foreign site and get an email to your phone or something. And then the feds will let you on the plane.
Yeah, I'll be doing that too.
It's pretty complicated. It took me a couple of hours to fill in the forms this afternoon. I mean, just, maybe it's just me.
I don't think so, from what I've heard. So I do have some questions. All right, so I'll go to the first one that came when people registered.
Well, I can read them as well. Which one do you want me to go to?
Okay, in the chat. So given that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are against the original SARS-CoV-2, but it's the variants now we have to worry about, how effective is the 4th shot for those who are eligible?
I'm in the Q&A. I'm not seeing that one.
Oh, okay. This is in the chat.
Okay, I'm not seeing that either in the chat. So I didn't really catch. The problem with an oral one is you can't really catch it.
Okay, so let's go to the Q&A.
Well, I think it just come up. Given the Moderna and Pfizer, well, you see, well, at the moment, are we fighting the last war? The only weapon we've got is the one that's fighting the last war. And I discussed whether changing the weapon to an Omicron variant vaccine. I discussed that, so I'm not going to go over it again. Okay. But again, in the booster context, what the booster does, whether it be a 3rd dose or a 4th dose of the original vaccine, it gives a reawakening of the antibody response, and it's at a high enough, the peak level is at a high enough level to deal with Omicron. But over the next few months, it will drop again. And at some point over those next several months, it will drop below the effective level and be less effective or ineffective at preventing mild infections. But again, these booster strategies are very effective at preserving protection against severe disease and death. So the risk at the moment is for most people for relatively mild infections. Now, there's a question here about long COVID, which is a highly topical question, because there's been a couple of papers and at least one newspaper story this week on the prevalence of long COVID in unvaccinated and vaccinated people. And the measurements were done in 2021, done by the VA and a CDC group. So they're done in 2021, so they're pre-Omicron. And we don't have any Omicron long COVID data yet. And the reason for that is the long in long COVID, because you could only see long COVID symptoms after an appropriately long period of time. And the measurements that were in the papers I just mentioned were done at 6 months post-infection. Well, the Omicron surge started here in around, well, let's call it January 1st. So 6 months from January 1st is getting on for pretty close to being soon. But it takes time to accumulate the data and analyze the data. So we're not there yet. We don't have a handle on Omicron. But for the previous variant, so most of the data is on Alpha and Delta. And, it depends on the group. But I think it's up to 10% or so of people had at least one symptom of long COVID. I mean, there are lots of manifestations of long COVID, and some of them are relatively mild. Some of them are quite serious. The most common manifestations were anything to do with the lungs, not surprisingly, and the circulatory system. And the prevalence is, at least in this study, was worryingly high. So it's higher than most people expected. So there are a lot of Americans who are having these delayed symptoms. Fortunately, most of them are not at a life-altering level there, but some are. And the other paper that came out showed that vaccination wasn't reducing long COVID symptoms by very much. It was only about 15% reduction. So it's better than nothing, but it wasn't a major effect. And so vaccine breakthrough cases in 2021, a lot of people are getting long COVID symptoms. I mean, we can argue about the numbers. I don't really want to spout out numbers because it depends on the age. It depends on the previous pre-existing health. People who were sicker to start with and older to start with were more likely to have long COVID symptoms than younger, healthier people. So no one number really encapsulates the magnitude of the data in these papers. But long COVID, it's going to be with us, unfortunately, or with many people for a long time.
I have a question before you get to the others. A lot of people said, when I got my booster, you should have mixed it, you should have, I had 2 Pfizer that said you should have gotten the Moderna.
No, this is a myth. I mean, it's like saying, I had a tube of red-colored vaccine. I want a tube of yellow-colored one. I mean, the Moderna vaccine is slightly stronger than the Pfizer vaccine. And that means it actually induces slightly worse side effects, sore arm levels. And it gives you about a 2-fold higher antibody level. So yeah, if you went and insisted on getting Moderna, you might get a bit more protection, but not to the extent that you should fuss about it and go back home and say, I'm sorry, they didn't have Moderna today. They only gave me Pfizer and I decided to come back in a few days' time. That's just being a bit too, pissy and prissy about it all. I don't think, you can do it if you want, but it's not a big deal.
Okay, let's go back to the questions. We now have many different vaccination statuses and are at different durations post the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th doses. Vaccine trials of new vaccines have not been tested in boosted population. How crucial is this knowledge gap?
What do we mean by new vaccines? I mean, there aren't a lot of trials going on brand new vaccines, but one of the things that the FDA makes the companies do is regular trials. I mean, the boosters were tested in clinical trials before they were rolled out. I mean, the FDA required the companies to submit data on how well the 3rd dose performed. And was it safe and was it effective? And they reviewed the package. And then that's also happened with 4th dose data. So everything is thoroughly tested. I mean, at a certain point, that might not be necessary because so much experience has been gained. And the same vaccines are used abroad. So you can also draw, although the FDA doesn't draw on foreign data, you can't pretend it doesn't exist. And everyone is in my field is aware of foreign data, and some of it is every bit as reliable as what we have. So you get more and more experience of these different boosting strategies. So I'm not sure what the questioner here means by vaccine trials of new vaccines. Oh, Pfizer's trial looks at 2 doses of original. No, the Pfizer original, well, again, yeah, this is what is being done. I mean, I said earlier that Moderna, and I'm pretty sure it's Pfizer as well, but I know the Moderna trial because I had to look it up. They are testing 2 doses of the original vaccine, and they are comparing an Omicron booster with a standard original booster. So that is absolutely, that was started in around February. And that's the one trial that we're really waiting for the results of. And last year, they tested Delta boosters, but we didn't need it. I mean, by the time, that the Delta wave had kind of been replaced by Omicron. So there are a lot of these small scale, but still informative trials that are being done. And the FDA essentially won't approve anything that's not got a body of clinical trial data behind it.
Okay. So I think I asked that question already. Medical professionals are arguing that eventually everyone's going to get it. We're not helping. How can we address this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just medical professionals. I think there's an attitude. I mean, I have never been infected, and okay, I'm well vaccinated. I don't do particularly stupid things, but I never got COVID when I shared an apartment with my wife in March 2020 when she had COVID. I didn't get it. And there's a natural variation in people's susceptibility to any respiratory virus infections. And I'm sure that includes COVID. And unfortunately, the genetics are not properly understood. They're going to be complicated. But I've always felt that because I very rarely get a bad cold and very rarely get flu, and just I'm not prone to respiratory virus infections, I felt that I was fairly protected by natural genetics, interferon responses, other aspects of natural immunity. But I can't prove that. I mean, there are studies, genuine studies by serious immunologists and geneticists to look at exactly this. And I think the information will be fascinating when it's finally uncovered. So, but we all know people who got pre-pandemic, anytime you have colleagues, friends, family, anytime a bug went round, they had it. There are some people who are hyper susceptible. It's a whole spectrum. We're an outbred genetic population. There's a whole spectrum of susceptibilities, and no one can know, except from personal life experience, roughly how susceptible you are or not. So I don't know, I've never been infected. I glare at incoming viruses and tell them to go away, except I don't use exactly those words. I don't think it's inevitable that everyone will be infected, but certainly a lot of people will be because of the highly transmissible nature of the Omicron variants, waning vaccine immunity, behavioral disinhibition, and, just sheer at some point your good luck runs out. But I certainly don't encourage people to believe that you're going to get it, so go out and get it. I think that's very misguided, particularly if there is a significant risk of long COVID symptoms. I absolutely do not advise people to go out and get infected. Avoid it if you possibly can without living in a basement. I mean, living in a basement isn't really practical. You have to get on with your life, but you should do so without being reckless, but without being paranoid.
So another question, if someone had a mild case of COVID after one booster, when should they get a second booster, if any?
I mean, the FDA is not being, and CDC have not been great on advice on this. Most of us, the people that I talk to and trust, we all regard an infection as equivalent to a vaccine dose. So if you had a mild case of COVID after one booster, I don't think you need another booster if you're in the appropriate age group for 4 to 6 months. The optimal time between these, what you call antigenic exposures, whether it's the antigen is in the vaccine or the virus, I wouldn't do it within 4 months. It's not dangerous. It's just not the right timing. 6 months is, 4, 5, 6 months, that kind of ballpark is more optimal for timing. So if you had a mild case of COVID in February, I don't think you need to do anything at the moment.
So, I mean, I got my second booster in February, but after 4 months, it's gonna just wear off.
Well, gradually, but again, you've got to look at your own personal health risk. Yeah. What is your health status? What are your risks? I mean, by now, savvy people like the people on this call should have a pretty good idea about their own health and welfare.
Okay. So in the chat, there's a kind of long question. If you can't see it, I can read it.
I can get into chat.
Okay.
Well, the first answer is consult your physician. I mean, I'm not a physician and I'm not going to give that degree of medical advice. You absolutely should consult your physician and take the best advice. And then the physician would have to weigh up the risks of getting COVID with the risks of whatever happened. And the Novavax vaccine might be more suitable in this context because it is less harsh for most people on the arms. I mean, when I had my 2 doses, I was in the Novavax trial. The only way I could tell which arm I'd had a vaccine in is it had a Band-Aid on it the next day. I literally couldn't feel a thing. Mind you, I probably have the immune system of an amoeba, so, don't draw on my lessons. So I would definitely consult your physician. Evishield, well, it's only available on prescription. So again, you have to consult your physician. Evishield is a monoclonal antibody combination that is called passive antibody protection. Vaccines give you active antibody protection because you're triggering the production of your own antibodies. With Evishield and related products, you're delivering them passively by injection. And I think it's about once every, maybe it's either a month or 2 months, I don't remember. And you get it's an injection. And that will wane off. I mean, that will, the antibodies will decay away in your body over time. So it's not permanent, but it will give you pretty decent protection for the recommended period, which I think is 2 months, something like that. But again, how do you get access to it? You consult your physician because it's done on prescription. And I saw a question here about nasal vaccines. Well, you hear a lot of chatter about nasal vaccines, and it's one of those perfectly reasonable ideas, but they're in trials, and there are, so there's nothing available, and there won't be anything available this year. And the idea is you induce mucosal, nasal, upper respiratory tract immunity. But there's a bit of a paradox here that mucosal vaccines don't trigger good serum body-wide antibodies. They trigger mucosal antibodies better than some systemic approaches. So some of the approaches that are being done are prime with an injectable in your arm mRNA vaccine and then boost with something up your nose. And maybe that gives you the best of both worlds, but these are still going through trials. And, one of the problems we have now is how do you prove that an entirely new vaccine works? So, we saw in 2020, phase 3 vaccine efficacy trials, and Pfizer and Moderna came up with, 95% efficacy compared to placebo. You can't do those trials now. Firstly, there are very few people left who have had neither a vaccine nor been infected, or both. So there's not enough naive people, and the ones who are not the kind of people who are volunteering for phase 3 trials. And then, is it ethical to give someone a placebo during an active pandemic when there are vaccines available? And remember, in 2020, you could ethically do a placebo because there were no standard vaccines available. This was the only way people could get it. But that's changed now. So it's going to become increasingly difficult to assess the efficacy of entirely new vaccine concepts, not a booster, not a changed, not something that's an adjustment, but an entirely new nasal vaccine. The FDA hasn't given any guidance on how the hell you're going to test it and prove it works.
So there's one population, of course, including my grandchildren, who are all under the age of 5 who have not been vaccinated.
Sure.
They actually did get COVID and spread it to the family. I do understand that Pfizer and Moderna has said they've tested it. When do you think children that age population will be getting vaccines?
Well, again, I think those meetings are on the FDA's docket in June. They've got a busy June before people go on vacation, I guess. So the under 5, there was news last week on the 3rd Pfizer dose, was it?
Yeah.
So I expect that there will be a decision on that within weeks.
It's kind of hard not to give it to that population, right?
Many parents are very enthusiastic about it, and many parents are nervous and want to see whether, you know, little Johnny and Sally from the same class are fine afterwards. Somebody else's kids can go first, and that again, in part, you know, reflects, well, one, natural conservatism by parents about their children, and the other is the influence of disinformation that is all over the place. And, you know, some parents, unfortunately, have been believing it. So, yeah, but some parents really embrace the concept, and good for them. I would, if I had grandchildren, which I don't, then I would advise my kids to get their kids vaccinated as soon as available.
Oh, I know my daughter will have her kids first. So is it possible in the future the optimum protection can be acquired by getting a newly developed vaccine and an earlier version of the vaccine simultaneously?
I'm not sure about simultaneously, but if there's a new vaccine that came along that gives you a dramatically improved immunogenicity, you could use it as a booster.
Right. Yeah.
I imagine that might be a feasible scenario. I don't see what, well, you know, to give two things simultaneously, you'd have to understand whether they would go well together. You can't give a simple answer to that. You'd have to look at the science of the vaccines. And again, there'd have to be a trial to prove that it was safe and effective. The FDA wouldn't just say, here's a new vaccine, go and get that one and this one without us testing it. That's, you know, one of the basis of trust in vaccines is that the FDA does have pretty stringent requirements.
So I know a while back there was talk by combining a COVID vaccine for the fall with a flu vaccine. Is that still up in the cards?
Not in the same vaccine. The only trial of that bivalent flu plus COVID vaccine that's reported is actually again from Novavax. They had a phase 1 trial of two vaccines in one vial vaccine. And the results look quite reasonable, but it's phase 1. It's, you know, minimal number of people. It's designed to find the right dose. It looks safe, which you kind of expect. And it generated antibody responses to both components, but that's going to take well over a year to get to an approval state, you know, sometime next year, maybe. So there's no option at the moment of getting a combined vaccine. But of course you can get a flu vaccine and a COVID vaccine booster. You might not want to do them on the same day. And if you're susceptible to sore arms, you might want to spread that out a week. But you can certainly, there's no reason not to get a flu vaccine this fall. And it's possible that this year we'll have a bad flu season. The previous 2 years, we have not had much of a flu season because of mask wearing and social distancing. And you know, that stops you getting a flu virus. If you're wearing a mask, a flu virus is stopped just as effectively. There was a paper recently suggesting that a flu vaccine actually can give you short but significant protection against COVID by what's something called trained immunity. You trigger these natural, innate, non-antibody interferon type responses. So you get a flu vaccine and it kind of activates your local immune system in the nose, and that will buy you a month's extra protection against COVID. In fact, again, you know, against infection by the COVID virus. That was an interesting paper. There's, you know, it wasn't a huge effect, but it was in the right direction.
So airplanes now, masks are pretty optional, except in maybe 1 or 2 countries in Europe. Is that causing problems?
Well, if you get infected on a plane without wearing a mask, then you've got a problem. You know, it's this societal issue that, you know, America is so reluctant to be sensible and wear a mask. They, you know, this feeling that it's an imposition on your freedom and it's incredibly inconvenient. And I mean, I just don't buy that. I mean, I don't buy the freedom aspect. I mean, you want the freedom to make a bad choice. I mean, you're free to stick your head in an oven, but it's probably not a good idea. Yeah, I just despair at attitudes in the States, and it's not just the States. I mean, it's true in Europe as well.
England and European countries.
Oh, there are people there that are just as crazy. I mean, it's just the only thing is they don't carry guns in England. But I just don't buy this. I mean, there's inconvenience to wearing a mask, but it's a damn sight more inconvenient wearing a ventilator if something goes wrong when you have to finish up in the ICU. So yeah, I mean, if I was on a plane, and I'd wear a mask. And if somebody told me not to, I'd say my body, my choice, and then use some polite words that wouldn't be very polite.
Okay. So since you were involved in Novavax clinical trials, and given the fact that we really haven't moved much, I mean, I think 35% of the country is still not vaccinated.
Sure.
When this, with any vaccine. So when this vaccine comes out, do you think some people might say, well, it seems to have less side effects, seems to,
Well, it's possible. I mean, some of the lies that are thrown around about the mRNA vaccines is specific to mRNA vaccines. Right. It's a nucleic acid. It will change my DNA. It'll permanently modify me, which of course is complete utter rubbish. I could use other words. And some of it is, oh, it's all too new. They were developed too quickly, which is, again, not accurate. So Novavax uses older school technology. So at least, and it's not an mRNA. So it doesn't have those slurs thrown at it. But it won't be long before the anti-vaxxers come up with a Novavax specific slur, and I can already guess what it is. But, the anti-vaxxers will never give in. There's a huge article in the New York Times today about the ultimate goal of the anti-vaxxers, and this is not news to me, but maybe news to some people, is that their goal is to eliminate childhood vaccination completely. I mean, they don't want any kids to get any vaccines ever. And they are working on parents to persuade them that the vaccines will damage their kids, autism will come up again, more garbage. And they're also working on Republican legislatures to remove all mandates for childhood vaccinations as a conditions to go to school. These guys won't stop, not until somehow, some way, we find a way to jail them. So yeah, there's the reason why 30% of Americans are not vaccinated is substantially now the politics and the disinformation. They believe, the Republican mantra about vaccination and the right-wing media, and most Fox News is wishy-washy, and they believe social media, and they believe that ivermectin is a better choice, or hydroxychloroquine is a better choice, and they believe that if you wear a mask in school, your children can't breathe. There's this weird dichotomy that, according to these people, the masks let viruses through but won't let oxygen molecules through. I mean, is that insane? Oxygen molecule is a little bit smaller than a virus.
But, as you know, there are also people on the left who are very anti-vaccine as well, and, especially in California against the...
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, and that's really we hate big pharma attitude. We hate big pharma because it exists, because it profits, because of it's, all the things that there exist to hate big pharma. And there's very little you can do about that. But whatever your attitude to big pharma is, the vaccines that they made with the help of a lot of, non-big pharma scientists have saved an awful lot of lives. So if you want to, run your life on dogma and run a risk of dying, well, you can do that, but it's again not a very wise choice.
Okay, so any final thoughts before we let you go?
No, I think people, again, the more educated, the more aware, the more that they make wise decisions whenever possible, the better off we'll all be. I mean, there's another thing just come up in the chat. The smallpox eradication program worked. And polio was almost eradicated worldwide. Polio was eliminated in the States, essentially. And childhood infections were managed in the States. I mean, you know, our parents, I mean, I'm pretty old, but our parents and some of your grandparents will remember the era in the 50s and 60s when there was genuine fear that your children may not grow up because of lethal infections. I mean, polio was a huge fear factor in the 1940s and 1950s, and nobody thinks about it. You know, I'm of an age when I got a smallpox vaccination at school. Everyone did. We don't vaccinate against smallpox now. We don't need to, and hopefully it will never come back. But you know, vaccinations have been probably, I think there's a stat on this I saw a while back, the single most life-saving medical development in the history of mankind, possibly except clean water, you know, water purification. You know, and yeah, it did end up in iron lungs. There are still in America today survivors of polio from the 1950s who spent their entire life in an iron lung. There was a letter written to a science journal from a man who'd been in an iron lung since he was about 5 years old, and he was now 60 odd, you know, 60 years ago plus. And he said he spent an entire life in an iron lung, and he was thrilled to be able to get a COVID vaccine because the last thing he wanted was to have COVID while in an iron lung. And he said, you know, people forget just how horrible it was. And he is a living memorial to the horror of polio in the people who had, and people died. I mean, he at least survived, and he made a huge amount out of his life within the physical constraints of what he had to live through.
Yeah, Philip Roth's last book was about polio.
Yeah, it was a very moving letter. I mean, it had an impact on a lot of people who read that. It was, you know.
Could you send me it? I'd like to see it.
Yeah, drop me an email tomorrow and I'll try and find it.
I will, yeah. But yeah, we did one a segment on polio, and Jonas Salk was, you know, a hero to people. I mean, he was invited to the White House. Dwight Eisenhower thanked him for saving so many lives, and you know.
Yeah, there was more to polio than Salk, but Salk was very, very, very good at media relations, whereas the other people who had made the Sabin vaccine, for example, had a sort of more traditional, quietly beavering in the background attitude. But sure, he played a role, but less of a role than the public chooses to remember.
Well, same with Watson and Crick. There were other people involved.
Sure, you know, of course. I mean, that's the nature of it. But there were other. I mean, most people then finished up having the Sabin vaccine, which is live attenuated, the one on a sugar lump.
I remember getting it.
Yeah, so do I. I mean, you know, we got to school.
Yeah.
It was, and there was no controversy about this. This was viewed by our parents as, do not miss school that day. We want you vaccinated.
And that's, you know, and my daughter asked me when she was watching Mary Poppins, what's a spoonful of sugar? Talking about it. And I said, that's the polio vaccine.
Spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Yeah. So anyway, Dr. Moore, it's always delightful to have you on my show. Thank you for making the time. I know you're busy. Safe travels, and everyone have a very happy Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you in the upcoming weeks.
Yep. Good night to everybody. Pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good night.